Hello, everyone. Welcome to Rash's World. Today we have a very special guest. We have Bruce Hunter. How are you doing today?
Wonderful. It's fantastic to be able to join your podcast today.
Thank you for joining. The first question is quite interesting and will give us a lot of clues about each of the guests. And my first question is, how would you briefly describe yourself?
And the shortest description I can give is stubborn.
Okay, I like that.
You can spell it differently as perseverance.
I like
Uh,
determined. I like determined and passionate.
those also work too, and I think it describes most of the people I love dearly because I think those are skills for life, or
Mhm,
qualities for life, more accurately. The skills come out of the determination and passion.
mhm. I want to talk about your book, latest book here, and various other things too. But in the Bear's House, and what would you say about your book here? What is it about? What are some of the themes you're looking at? And then we'll also get more information about the author himself through this.
Okay. I'm happy to answer any and all of that, and there's no such thing as an awkward question as far as I'm concerned. I was a teacher for many years, and I've been an advocate for people with disabilities of different types for many years. And one of the things that I have always maintained, which is why I wrote the book, is that we need to talk.
Yes, yes, it's long
Where I
overdue.
go from there. The book, the title, first of all, is a backcountry
Mhm,
analogy for the wilderness. And the basic gist of it is mind your manners, you're in the bear's house.
mhm,
And this is his or her house, not ours.
mhm,
And we share that house.
mhm,
One of the themes that's explored in the book is the difference between First Nations response to the wild, and that includes the wild in us as well as the wilderness and the spirit of all things, including things that are not living, which sometimes we forget about, have their own energy. And the science is there to support that. Uh, Geologists will tell you about rocks and mountains. I was trained as an arborist. I can
mhm,
certainly tell you about trees. And to be quite scientific about it, a lot of that is chemistry and physics.
mhm,
The lift of a tree sap and the sharing of chemistry or chemicals rather, nutrients that trees share with other trees.
mhm,
Um, so that's the first part of it. The second part is it's a series of love stories. It's a love story for the land, the people, and the mountains. And it's also a love relationship between a very creative mother and her young deaf son.
mhm,
And so the story progresses in a parallel plot told mainly by the mother. It's in the mother's voice, first person, and third person, as one critic said, third person maternal. In other words, this is the mother's wide angle on her young son's life. As often happens with young people with disabilities, they struggle. And in the book, my young character, Trout, nicknamed for the wild by his family, gets into a lot of trouble.
mhm,
And he's not doing well in school because he doesn't have access to sound, even though he's in a regular school system at the time, which is the early 1960s, late 1950s. And it is, in a sense, a sociology of the time. And I did a lot of research to try to understand my parents' generation, which was post-war and post-Korean War, and then the boom that followed after the Second World War in development across Canada. And also, the parallel plot is when the young boy, the young deaf boy, goes to live in the wilderness. And he's living adjacent to a First Nations group who later has their land flooded. And that's an unfortunately archetypal story
mhm,
around the world for Indigenous and First Nation people. Um, he's very touched by that, by the First Nations, because they include him in everything. And
Mhm.
so there's inclusivity about the culture, which he's not experienced up until that time. Um, so he's not treated differently, he's just included. And I won't give away too much of the story, but I've heard a lot from historians and journalists and mothers of children with disabilities about the accuracy.
Mhm.
And it is a fictional memoir. And what I mean by that, obviously, I'm writing it from a mother's point of view, and I'm not a mother, and
Mhm.
I'm not a woman. There's that fiction, but there's also the fiction that I wanted it to be typical of
Mhm.
what happened in the 50s and 60s, because I wanted to reproduce that time. And very quickly, things happen, and then we no longer hear about them. But those very events have led to the events that are happening today. So I have an understanding of the past and present, and I wanted to convey that in the book. It took me almost 8 years to write this. Uh, Part of what happened was 3 years in, after doing the research and interviewing the mothers of deaf sons, particularly, I realized I'd made a mistake because I was writing in third person, and I realized I needed to tell the story of the mother.
Mhm.
And so I started all over again.
Oh no.
And that turned out to be the best thing that I could have done because I think what I hear from people, and this is a re-release, so I've heard a lot about that previous release about the mother and how heartfelt and
Mhm.
authentic that is. And that's a great compliment to any writer, and certainly to me. Um, so that's the basic gist of the
Mhm.
book.
Mhm. Mhm. There are two themes I'd like to talk about more, and one of them is again the child Trout growing up and the difficulties he faced with society, and I think and again the idea of being invisible or being different and standing out and not being accepted, and these are things that are also universal, but especially in that case of having a disability. And the second thing is again our relationship with nature too, and especially when you look at the Western concept of it, and maybe starting off with that point first, where I think in our Western conception, it's like we either try to control it and say this is mine, I'm going to make it even better and make it take advantage of it, or the other side, which is like the romantics, where you just like adore it and you just see only an ideal nature and you don't see the dark side, that the sea can is not only peaceful, but it can kill you and tornadoes can appear. So, what would you say about that and our relationship with nature here, I think?
Well, it's if I can go back to what I introduced, which is there's a rift between cultures when it comes to the wilderness, to wildlife, and to nature. Even the concept of nature
Mhm.
itself
Mhm.
is something, special, something that is kind of detached from us, is abstract.
Mhm.
And
Right.
like people talk about writing about the land, and I will say, well, what about the soil?
Yeah.
And I went to agricultural school before I went to university and trained as a landscaper and as an arborist. And when I was in Italy for the first time about 15 years ago, and I've been in love with Italy since the sixth grade, so, and I'm not Italian. And
Mhm.
I published primarily in Italy for the last few years. But one of the first things I did was when I went to the vineyard and I was staying overnight in a little inn overlooking the vineyards in Chianti, is I did what I learned in school and what I learned in my apprenticeship. I went down to the vineyard and I lifted a bit of soil to my lips and I tasted it.
Mhm.
Then I spit in a clump of soil and it clumped, and that would tell me a lot of different things about the quality of the soil and what would grow there. So what happened the next day was the vintner came and showed up in his massive Mitsubishi four-wheel drive with tractor chains and everything in it, and mud all over the place. and gave me a tour of his lands. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. I don't speak Italian, and I'm deaf, and there were a lot of things that could be barriers to communication, but I do speak the language of soil.
Mm.
And I understand irrigation. I understand plants. But I'm also humble because I realize it's always changing and we're always learning. Of course, I went to a new country and I'm learning about the things I thought I already knew. And all of a sudden, my eyes were opened up in a whole different way. And interestingly enough, I'm not a wine drinker.
Oh no, that's bad.
And I was more interested in the vines and the soil and the history. But for me, and I've learned this over the years, both from the elders in my own family, the Scottish great grandmothers and grandfathers and great great uncles and so on, that we're not separate from nature.
Hmm.
And that was also reinforced by the elders, the First Nations, Stoney Nakoda in Alberta that I met, later on Blackfoot and Cree. Their idea of capital N nature is very different. The land is part of their identity, part of their spirituality, part of their essence. And this, I think, comes to a crunch in the novel
Hmm.
where my young character, Trout, sees a bear in the garden of the ranger station where he's living, and his great aunt grabs a rifle and goes out to warn the uncle that there's a bear in the berry patch. And because the uncle is deaf, he doesn't hear this.
Mm.
He's surprised. And of course, I'm not going to give away the rest of the story, but later on, he has a relationship, a platonic relationship, although he's smitten
Mm.
with this older, slightly older, 2 years older, which of course, when you're young is like
It's
20
a
years.
huge deal, huge difference. Yeah.
But she's older and more savvy because she's lived in the bush alongside all kinds of creatures, including bears. And she said, well, my grandfather says, there's a time to walk with the bear and there's a time to hunt the bear.
Mm. Hmm.
In other words, we don't make ourselves large, we don't scream, we don't do all of that. We simply walk. And that for me, I think was an emblematic uh, revelation as to the differences between the cultures. And I was in Italy recently, and I was telling a lot of bear stories
Hmm.
because especially the young people there are fascinated. And there are bears in Italy and Abruzzo and places like that in the mountains. But the fear of bears is actually greater than the bear itself.
Mm,
And
that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and I think if I have a lesson to teach through this book and anything I say in the podcast today, I think the universality of the story, my story, and the story of my young boy and his mother, is the greatest disability is fear.
Hmm. Yeah.
Fear can cripple us, and fear is the root of many things, including discrimination,
Hmm.
racism,
Hmm.
war, all kinds of things. So there's a universality in that. And I think what I've learned from the disability, interestingly enough, is I can be crippled by the fear of not hearing, not knowing, not seeing, all those things. Um, or I can say, bring it on. Let's see what happens.
I love that. I
That's
love
not
that.
foolish. It's not reckless.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
um, a wiser response.
Yes.
And to sort of break this down, when I did my first trip to Italy 15 years ago, it was a week after I retired because I wanted to do something entirely different that I'd never done before. And so my wife and I got ready to go. And I had a panic attack one night. I said,
Mm.
I'm deaf. I can't hear. And especially in languages where there's the high frequencies. I have almost no high frequencies. Even with powerful assistive devices, I wear a cochlear implant in one ear and a hearing aid in the other. And then the other side of my brain kicked in, the survival part of the brain, and said, "You idiot, you're deaf in every language in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have nothing to fear. You've been this way all your life,
Yeah.
and you've always found a way." And the other thing I think is there's no underestimating the generosity of people
Yes.
when
Yes.
you try. And I think that's the really important thing. And I say that as a teacher, as a person, a grandfather, and as a writer. I think it's really important to try and keep trying. And one of the things I'm writing about, like today, because there's advanced promotion coming out for the book, is that to use a baseball metaphor, the ball baseball metaphor, I'm going to be 73 in 2 weeks. And I have an Italian book in one hand in the Bears house, an Italian translation. And I have this brand new copy in English, which is a re-release, which doesn't happen because
Hmm.
it costs a lot of money to reproduce a book, to reprint it, and there's no funding for it.
Hmm.
It somehow has been left off the page in funding. So the onus is on the publisher, and the publisher really have to believe in a book. And unfortunately, both my editor and my publisher really do believe in this book, and that's a wonderful thing.
Hmm.
But the lesson out of that for me, um, keep getting up to bat.
Hmm.
It's really important because you're going to strike out. That's inevitable. And I think one of the things we don't do in teaching enough is teach people what failure means.
Yes.
This means you have to get up to bat again.
Yeah.
And that takes courage. It takes courage for me. I'm not reckless or foolish about any of this. I'm certainly very aware of what can go wrong. But as we say in my hometown of Calgary, this
Hmm.
is not my first rodeo.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
When I fall, I get back up.
Yes. Of course.
That's what matters.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point you're making about fear, but also our preconceived notions about that. So I grew up in Germany, and my school was I was the only foreigner, so I was kind of standing out and invisible at the same time, like you're saying. Of course, not in the
Yeah.
same way, but the experience is somewhat similar, how it feels to me in that context. But then also overcoming the fear and reaching out. And so I had friends who said, we don't like foreigners. They told me up front, we don't
Yeah.
like and but we are different. So I think that's a good way because then I'm kind of creating a difference in their mind. It's like maybe not all of them are bad. Maybe some are like a rash. And so it's not being afraid of even talking to people who don't accept you because they don't know you. It's based on fear. They have these preconceived notions
Exactly.
that are based on false ideas, right? And these are or experiences they've had, negative experience and so on, and try to counter that. And I think that's really important to see the humanity and to show the humanity to others and not stopping ourselves from reaching out, even though it takes a lot of courage and it's very difficult at times too.
I, I think that's really important. And I think uh, for far too long in my life, I was angry and I was bitter for
Mhm.
all kinds of reasons. Not just the disability, but I think the fact that our home life, especially later on as I was a teenager, was not good. And it's an understatement. So when I wrote the book, that's where the fictional memoir comes in, because I think the difference between reality, which is heartbreaking, and
Mhm.
fiction, at least my understanding of fiction, is I want to offer some hope. I
Mhm.
want to offer an out, and I want to speak to the experience you had.
Mhm.
For me, it's very real for other reasons.
Mhm.
And it keeps happening,
Mhm.
because people don't always know how to handle this, and they don't
Mhm.
know how to handle their own fears. And of course, ignorance, or sorry,
Mhm.
fear comes out of ignorance.
Yes.
They
Yes.
don't know you. They don't know
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And a story that I think kind of illustrates this. I was invited as a teacher to go walk with the elders in southwestern Alberta. And we were looking at one of the large medicine wheels. And I noticed that the Cree elder and the Blackfoot elder kept talking about non-Indigenous. And both of these men were about the same age as me, which means they would have gone to a residential school. So
Mm,
right away, I felt a polarity because um, just the language they were using. And I have First Nation friends. That's not how they talk.
mhm, mhm,
They were using polite language. And I remember thinking, and not only that, the friend who invited me didn't advise me what we were doing. So I would dress ridiculously like someone going on a cruise. So
mhm,
I really looked out of sort. You know, we're going to the back of a pickup truck and we're, having our snacks and our food and all this. And here we are out in the middle of the prairie. There's nothing for miles. And I knew that one guy was speaking Cree and the other guy was speaking his language. And so at that point I said, well, could someone give me direction to the washroom? And everyone kind of looks at me sideways. Well, there's no washroom out in the middle of the prairies. So
mhm,
that's fine. I was setting myself up as, the foolish tourist,
mhm,
uh, non-Aboriginal guy.
mhm,
And so I came back and I said, the thing about the public washrooms, there's never any toilet paper. And so they looked at me and then I said, by the way, I was almost sent to a residential school,
mhm,
but my mother stepped in and stopped it because
mhm,
she wanted her son to be with his brothers and sisters, friends and relatives in his neighborhood. And they looked at me sideways. I could tell they were trying to figure out, like, what was I? Who was I?
mhm,
And I said, no, no, no. I said, it was the 50s and 60s. Anybody that we didn't know how to deal with, we sent away. And it could be psychiatric, it could be disabilities. They were called boarding schools, they were called training schools, all the different phrases depending on the part of the country and what the specific was. And that is not in any way to take away from the atrocities of residential schools. That's not my point. My
mhm,
point is when you start to understand your own experience, you start to understand the experiences of other people.
mhm.
And that was a large part of the reason I wrote the book. I wanted to understand my parents' experience,
Yeah.
and I wanted to understand what in hell was going on in the time.
Mhm,
Like, what was the thinking or lack of? And there were very few options at the time because we didn't have the knowledge we have now. And a lot of the things we have learned about ourselves and about different cultures have happened in the last few years, the last 30 years, particularly around disabilities.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I think something like literature, like your novel specifically, is taps into that, so we can really get the perspective and get to know what it feels like. And I think we don't have access to it if again we don't know people that we can engage with. So that is a great entry into that of understanding things and the issues that happen because we don't have that information and many people don't. And so that the empathy can again literature is wonderful for that poetry as well. I think it opens up these worlds to connect with others on a very deep level, and it takes courage to also show that on your side, so you included a lot of your own experiences too in the novel, right?
Yeah, yes and no. And
Okay.
because it's been so long since I finished it, what happened when you're a writer or an actor or a musician,
Hmm.
all kinds of things, you internalize it.
Hmm.
You internalize, for example, research to the point where did it happen? Or did I imagine it? So it's as much a work of imagination because, I
Yeah.
might start with a little sliver of experience and to, kind of put this in perspective, one of my longtime friends from high school read the novel, and there's some juicy parts. Um, Hopefully not obscene, but they are juicy because it's portraying, teenage life, high school
Yeah.
life, you're exploring and all that. And he said, "You didn't have that much sex in high school." I said, "Poetic license." But I think, to get back to the earlier point, I think the idea of empathy and imagination is so important. And I wanted to write about this, not so much to tell my own story, but to tell the story of the time.
Mhm.
Because I have a lot of friends who, like me, identify as small d deaf. And what that means to those of us in my little community is we use assistive devices. We use American Sign Language sometimes because different people in our community have different levels of hearing loss and different ways of communicating. But one of the things I wanted to do, I wanted to tell our story.
Mhm.
And the most authentic way I could do it was from the mother and then from the boy and his experiences. But I thank God I have a very good accountant because I was able to, phone him up and say, I have this idea for, scene. Um, can I go on a dog sled trip? And he said, if it's research, yes. And I said, wonderful. I'm going dog sledding. So I've never been dog sledding and until that point in my life. And I think I was about 50 at that point. And well, you heard what my friend said about high school, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, and no, that's part of your research there too, right? For the book too, the dog sledding, or I
Well,
mean, using that experience.
the thing research, I taught sociology for a long time, and
Mm,
part of what you do in sociology is you go out and interview people. So you
mhm,
try to get samples of the population and understand what was going on.
mhm,
And so I had a lot of fun talking to the mothers, to audiologists, hearing aid dispensers, and so on. And one very funny
mhm,
theme rather, that came up, and it sounds silly, but if you understand what's going on, it gives you an idea of what someone with hearing loss or who is deaf experiences. But after a while, one of the first questions I would ask the mother of a young deaf child, does your son fart? And they would start laughing and go, oh my God, does he fart? And of course, I realized it, and this is, my own experience, but I wanted to see, like, how far across does this reach?
mhm,
And when you think about it from the point of view of someone who can't hear, when you fart, especially publicly, you get a reaction.
mhm,
On one level, it's communication, then the ultimate sensory experience, maybe a little gross, but it works.
mhm.
And it also evokes laughter.
Yeah.
And I never really wanted to write about this until I learned, and I was giving a speech for Centennial College's awards banquet for teachers. And when I realized I could make people laugh with this material, then I think I was ready to write more. And when I did the research, I was looking for a template. To be honest, I was looking for a model that could help me, construct this world, because it ultimately what the novel tried to do, to construct a world in which people who are not like me, um, and not like a lot of others, can move into that world and experience the world. So at the time, and this would have been about 1998, I think, and the web was in its infancy and so on. And I watched over the next 5 years, like how stuff came online that wasn't there before.
Mhm,
Um, uh, Especially in the First Nations community, a lot of the history. up until fairly recently, had been oral. So stuff was starting to come online, and but I couldn't find a novel about deafness by a deaf author.
Oh,
And
okay.
I thought, this is really interesting. And I was a literature teacher for a long time, and I thought, now I know not a lot of stuff is online, so I'm allowing for that. But I thought, this is really interesting. I found a lot of self-help books, memoirs, of course, Helen Keller,
Hmm.
all that, but that's not a novel.
Hmm.
And I wanted to write something that was interpretive, that was fictional.
Hmm.
And as I said, and more on the sociological side as well as the personal side. And I
Hmm.
did not want it to be a pity party or a victim story. I wanted it to be a strong characters, there's many of them in the book, um, who faces challenge and fails miserably at times, but comes out of that experience and starts to realize that there are things he can do, things he can make, things he can create. So in one sense, it's a love story for the people in the landscape, but in another sense, um, it's a lyric to creativity and imagination.
Hmm. Yeah, I just brought back an experience I had. I had a professor at university who was blind, and so the whole class atmosphere was different because I would raise my hand and people would tell me, "Yeah, well, she can't see you." Right? So it was like very different because then you have to adjust to different circumstances. But then you notice that she was excellent recognizing our voices. She immediately knew who was speaking. Right. And so it's also that the situation is different. But there are other things that kind of make up for the loss that one has. I think the body is amazing in that sense. And also another example I heard about this guy who went to a deaf school with children, and his wife was teaching them, and then she stepped out. And then suddenly he said he felt disabled because he could not communicate with them. So it's sometimes also the context. It's like you find yourself in a different situation. Well, how do I communicate now, right? And it's our perspective of one side, but what about the other side? And I think again we have to look at the whole picture of both sides and the experiences that people have that are different, and to adjust to that. I mean, in my case, I stopped raising my hand, just blurted out, I have a question.
Well, and I think that is so important, and I'm a real science follower.
Mhm.
My early training was in botany and things like that, and later on I went on and studied in the humanities and arts and so on. But it's really interesting to read the research, the
Mhm.
neuroscience of disabilities,
Yes.
because what actually happened to the brain when you have a disability over a long period of time, or even a short period of time, is that the brain rewires.
Mhm. Yes.
So in other words, we used to call it compensation,
Yeah.
but it's really a rewiring of the
Yeah.
brain. And the most recent example for me was learning to use the cochlear implant because it does not amplify. What it does is it picks up the raw data of sound, transmits it directly to the cochlea.
Mhm.
But what it looks like if you were to take computer code and throw it all up in the air, that's really what it is. So the brain have to translate that into words. And when you first listen to it, it sounds like gibberish.
Mhm.
And it's high pitch because your brain had, like my brain hadn't heard that since I
Mhm.
was 18 months old.
Okay.
So, and that adaptation takes about, depending on the person and all the circumstances, 3 months to a year or 2 years. So the last few years, I have been adapting to this new way of hearing in one ear, and then in the other ear, the amplification of the hearing aid. But the science on it is really interesting because the brains of children, this is according to Oliver Sacks' voice, Seeing
Mm.
Voices,
Okay. Yeah.
which was a dramatic book for me.
Okay.
And when I read it for the first time, and I was reading about all the young deaf people coming from all over the United States on buses to join in a protest at the Deaf University in Washington, D.C. Um, it was a silent protest because they're using sign language.
Oh my goodness.
I wept when I read that because I thought, well, first of all, this is beautiful.
Yeah.
Second of all, I have no community. The
Hmm.
greatest, I think, obstacle I faced for a lot of my life in the early years anyway, and I think you faced this as well, isolation,
Hmm.
and what do we need to do to break out of the isolation? And that was around the time I decided, well, if I can't find any books novels rather, or poetry by deaf writers, then I'm going to write that book.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
That, and my own research, talking to deaf and hard of hearing people all over different circumstances, is that you would think we want to hear, and that that's up to the individual, of course. But the greater impulse seemed to be we want to be heard.
Hmm.
And your experience with the blind professor,
Hmm.
if you put up your hand,
Hmm.
you're not heard.
Yes.
If
Yeah.
you speak, you are
Yes.
heard. And that neuroscience and how he has recognized every voice
Hmm.
is very different from the average person. And if I can generalize about hearing people,
Yeah.
is hearing people assume because they hear, they're listening.
Uh-huh.
Because I can't hear, I've had to work really hard at listening, and it's exhausting
Yeah.
because I'm doing several things at once. I'm translating, I'm retranslating, I'm making sure that, okay, does that make sense in terms of the context, which for me can be very difficult. Like, for example, in a class or a meeting, I always made sure I was sitting very close to the professor or the chair of the meeting, whatever, but I couldn't hear the people at the other end.
Uh-huh.
So, I'm listening hard, I'm working hard, but I'm not getting all the information. So my brain is always working overtime to fill that in. That was good practice for being a writer.
Okay. Yeah.
It really, I mean, I think in some ways I had no choice. And I became a speed reader by the
Uh-huh.
time I was 8 or 9 years old, because that was my primary means of receiving information. And I have a terrible auditory memory. You tell me something, I forgot it 5 seconds later.
Mhm.
I read it, I can't forget it.
I'm very similar that way. Yeah. Yeah. More visual. And yeah, so there's the movie The Color of Paradise, the Iranian film about this blind boy and how he is interacting with nature and imagining things. He's touching everything, and it's like a very different view of it, like a more
Mhm.
intimate, I would say too. And going back to like also listening, I think we're actually pretty awful at listening because most of the time we take it for granted. We focus on other stuff, again, visual cues, or we make up our own stories. But actually listening to the other person, I think that's really an art form that we're not really good at, and to begin with, for those who can hear.
I probably in most of the classes I taught, I always had a module on listening, and
Hmm.
I would do a listening assessment with the students, an objective listening assessment, self-assessment
Hmm.
for them, and then I would teach the different aspects, and the one really important one is eye contact.
Yes.
And the other is making sure that the voice, and you do this very well, by the way, this is my compliment.
Oh, thank
You've not turned away from the camera once, and I have. And you've not dropped your voice
you.
from the microphone.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the most difficult people to understand sometimes are teachers. I know a lot of teachers who are poets and writers, and my heart sinks when I hear them say, I'm a teacher, I don't need a mic. Okay, the mic is not for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's for me, it's for all of us. And anytime you turn your head slightly or drop to look at the book or whatever you do, you've lost people. And I know this because for me, it's amplified.
Hmm.
A lot is amplified. And again, research is always your friend. Um, what the studies show is by standing closer to somebody, you have actually raised your voice 10 decibels, as much as 10 decibels.
Oh, okay.
And in the group of hard of hearing and deaf people that I belong to in York region, one of the things I've noticed, well, of course we speak too loudly because if you can't hear your own voice, it's going to be too loud, but not for you. And the other thing is we stand too close to each other. And we're comfortable with that because we're used to it.
Hmm.
But I know as a teacher, I would always have to say to my students, I'd make a joke of it. I said, I'm not making a pass at you. I just want to hear you.
Yeah, yeah,
And humor is a great antidote
yes.
to awkwardness, and as is teaching people.
Hmm.
It would be helpful if you did this. I think telling someone you're deaf or you're this or that, people are, well, that's nice, but
Hmm. Hmm.
but people do want to help if you can help them help.
Hmm. Yes. And so, what about technology? I mean, how important has that been too in like in helping and what is your experience with technology in relation to disabilities too?
Well, there is a chapter in a novel where the young boy Trout gets his first hearing aid.
Hmm. Hmm.
And father calls it a contraption. And the father's not being disrespectful. He's just saying that it's a piece of machinery.
Hmm.
And it's a beautiful piece of machinery. And the expectation is that this is going to fix this young boy. And that is one of the things people would, at least my experience has been, and the people I talk to in my group, is that this is not fixable. A hearing aid is not an ear. And it's really important to understand that. It's not like getting a pair of eyeglasses, which suddenly is clear, because first of all, the hearing loss is on a slope, and it's different for everybody. And it's also different situationally. If you're in a noisy room, almost everybody is hard of hearing.
Hmm.
So, the expectation on the technology are sometimes misplaced. That said, it's a powerful tool.
Hmm.
It's a very powerful tool. And got, and I parallel this in the novel because it was at the time, the early hearing aids were about the size of a Zippo lighter. And they had a cable that ran to your ear. It was a hard, I think it was Bakelite, that went in your ear. And they were not the most comfortable things. The quality of them was, well, if you're old enough to remember transistor radios,
Yeah, yeah.
okay, well, transistor radios, the sound quality was not great, but hey, you could,
No.
who cared? You've got
Yeah.
the music. And that's how I've looked at it. It's how can I use this tool? And I
Hmm.
grew up in a blue collar family, and my father was very adroit with all kinds of tools outside of his trade and had a natural instinct for that. And I learned from that. I didn't have the natural instinct, but I learned. And
Hmm.
a lot of these skills can be learned. So learning how to use the technology is a really important part. And one of my editors said one time, it's really interesting to follow the journey of Trout as he goes through school and he gets better hearing aids because he has more access to sound. And of course, one of the problems for someone like me in school or in a meeting and so on, I don't have access in the same way that you might have.
Hmm.
And I don't hold that against you. I'm not like that. That's not
Hmm.
how I think. But it means I'm struggling
Hmm.
just to keep up.
Hmm.
And survival is really not the way anyone wants to live. And I've always pushed beyond survival. And I try to teach my students that. Let's work on we'll get the survival stuff down, and then we'll get on to flourishing. And once you're flourishing, you're going to have fun.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
approach most things in life that way. Is that let's have fun.
Yeah,
I thought
absolutely.
about what we were going to do this morning. I brought the bottle of Prosecco up and I brought the books up and I thought, let's have a party.
That's right. That's right. Good for you. And I was watching the movie Sound of Metal, I think it's called, about this person who goes deaf again because he's playing like heavy metal and so the effects it has. But I found the whole like progress too, the progression of like first like rebelling and being angry when he's is in that deaf community and so on. Then he starts using technology and he doesn't like it. And he's like extremely like, no, this is terrible. And then he goes back to that deaf community. So it's like the whole like progress is like, yes, now I accept my condition and I will deal with this and I will connect with people who will get me. So, which is a completely different set of groups after his disability. Then it's like creating
Yeah,
new contact. And I thought in a sense, I mean, again, that's horrible, but at the same time, there's the uplifting part. There's the fun part where he has fun with this
yeah,
newfound community. And I think we need to focus also on that and perhaps more on that instead of, again, looking at the negativity of things, which exists, right?
I
I'm not denying
I
that.
agree. I think it's often difficult because you're in a world that first of all wants to fix you.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Second of all, want to tell you who you are. And I have a lovely friend, a number of friends that, but one of them said to me, "You're not deaf." And I said, "Well, at this point I didn't bring it up, but that's really interesting because if you took a wheelchair away from a paraplegic,
Yeah.
they're a paraplegic, whether they have a wheelchair or not.
Hmm.
That's where they have it.
Hmm.
And you're hearing me right now in ideal circumstances, and I don't appear to be having trouble, although I did miss part of one question and I think I answered it, but I'm not sure, and that's always the uncertainty. But there's a misunderstanding there, and that is, first of all, no one needs to be told what they are or what they're not. You
Yeah.
wouldn't do that to someone else from, any other circumstances. But I think part of that is not knowing. And
Yeah.
very often it's highly sophisticated people will say things like that
Yeah.
because they're not conscious of what the reality is. And part of why I wrote the book was to tell some good stories,
Yeah.
but also show what it's like not to hear and to hear. But the uplifting part for me in the book, thank God, this is what comes out of creativity, was how this young boy experiences the world. And really what listening is, that's what you're hearing, is experiencing. Are you experiencing um, empathetically the people
Hmm.
that you're surrounded by?
Hmm.
It doesn't matter who they are, and are you listening to the nuances? Research shows, I think, 40% of what people say is tone.
Yes. Yeah.
That I
Yeah.
found that really interesting because
Yeah.
I grew up loving the blues, and
Hmm.
yeah, Ed was a lot of different kinds of music. I mean, who the hell knows what the words are? And but in the blues especially, tone matters.
Yeah.
Musicians will go to hear other musicians just to hear their tone, like how they play the guitar, how they use the
Yeah.
microphone, all that kind of stuff. And I thought, well, that's very interesting that I cottoned on to the blues. And a lot of the blues is in the low tone. At least it's
Yeah.
what I gravitated towards, which is where my greater hearing is. But in the book and in my own life, I've always tried to move towards not just positivity, because I think positivity is kind of a low bar.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I celebratory.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
I think, we're here. This is now. And let's celebrate.
Yes.
That in itself is a wonderful thing. And get back to my story about Italy. When I
Uh-huh.
went to Italy for the first time, and I'm, over my anxiety now because I realized just relax and be who you are. is after the first glass or first bottle of wine, no one cares.
Yeah, exactly.
And we're all human and we're having fun and we're celebrating. It doesn't matter what we're celebrating, but it does matter that we're celebrating. So one of the great things that I have heard from people about the book is that it's a celebration of life, and that's all of life. That includes grief.
Yes,
That
yes.
includes fear. That includes the
And don't exclude those things. They add to it, because that makes the celebration even bigger because it's a complete package. That's what life is. It's not exactly the things that we want, only the good stuff. It's the whole package that comes with it. And let's look at it and let's celebrate all of it, I think.
I agree. I mean
Because
that
we have no choice either, right? It's not that we can choose. I choose not to die. It's like, well, good for you, but that's not the
yeah.
reality.
Well, and I think you know, turning around whether it's a disability of any kind or circumstances like poverty,
Mhm,
for example, um, you start to find the small joys.
mhm,
And like the character in my novel, although I took it far further in real life than he does, uh, he goes out to the garden and he takes care of the garden for his mother. And the garden is a silent place, which of course for him is fine. That's not bothersome.
mhm,
His sister, on the other hand, is a talker. She's a
mhm,
big talker. She's constantly talking. And that's her world. That's her garden.
mhm, mhm,
So, the young boy sees that. And when we're talking about the neuroscience of disability and compensation, I learned in my training as an arborist and as a landscaper, a lot of how we identify things is by smell.
mhm,
For example, when I'm in the garden, I'm constantly, crushing something because I love that sense of the
mhm,
smell of whatever it is, whether it's basil or rosemary or what have you. And then, of course, pine and fir, all of those different trees, maples. Magnolia doesn't smell very nice.
mhm. Good to
But
know.
that was part of my training, but also part of how I experienced the world. And on a lighter note, uh, my wife and I go to the mall, and I'm a coffee fanatic. I have to have my coffee.
Same
And
here. Yeah.
sorry, Tim Horton, it's not coffee.
Mhm.
It's what is this friend of mine, as a poet said, it's liquid cigarettes. Yikes.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm in the mall. I follow my nose. I can find a coffee place
Mhm,
that way. Coffee is a very strong smell anyway, but um, that's one of the compensations that come out of not hearing, and
mhm,
also the speed reading and
mhm,
retention of reading things.
mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much for such a wonderful discussion. My ignorance shows through too because when I was told, okay, I have a deaf guest, I was like, well, how are we going to do the podcast? And so there's also my lack of understanding there. But thank you so much for being on Arash's World for talking about your experiences. I have you as an editor, speaker, author, mentor, and many things more. Arborist as well. I think that's really fascinating too.
Show
And your
you a
book.
picture of the book before we.
Oh yeah, for sure. And to remind everyone, the book is In the Bear's House, and yeah,
This
yeah, maybe more to There we go. Yeah, and
handsome,
the
handsome
Bruce
group
Hunter. Yeah, where you
in
can
the
see it,
back.
and it's quite. It's also translated in Italian. I mean, you have a big following in Italy as well.
I
Yeah.
just came back from a tour of 4 cities in Italy,
Hmm.
and this is a testament, I think, to what I try to do. The book really speaks to people in Italy. I think especially young people because I'm writing about taboo subjects, whether it's homosexuality or different identities in all kinds of ways, and disability.
Hmm. Hmm.
I would have young people come up to me, and then there's the exoticism of the wilderness, and Canada is known around the world for its wilderness, and all the things around it. So I was very honored and humbled by that, but also hugely grateful that that story had reached across language and culture um, and the barrier that people have in communicating. But I want to thank you. It's been a wonderful opportunity to talk about this and tell a few stories. And I think one of the main things I've learned is don't take yourself too seriously, or no one else.
Exactly. I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thank you so
Best of
much.
luck.
Bye now.